Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this session of Never Forgotten, the War in the Far East and in Modern Memory. 75 years ago today, Japan surrendered to the Allies in the Second World War. It was noon in Japan, early morning in Britain. The news went around like wildfire. Soon they were dancing on the streets in Piccadilly Circus, outside Buckingham Palace, and on Regent Street. But somewhere, this war, the war in the Far East, was forgotten. Most of Europe had celebrated VE Day in May, but at this time there were many families who could not celebrate. Their husbands and their fathers were fighting in the tropical jungles in Burma, and they felt forgotten. They felt abandoned in a way. So when the war ended, there was exuberance all around. So here we are today to talk about this war, because while events like D-Day and Dunkirk are impressioned in people's minds, somehow the war in the Far East is not. So I have a fantastic panel of historians who are going to tell us all about this war, why it was forgotten, and all the difficulties that went with it. You know, was the terrain tough? Were we unprepared? Early defeats, and then the victories. So I'm going to introduce my panelists first, and then we'll take it from there. So starting with Dr. Harry Rafal. He's a historian at the Royal Air Force Museum. He's responsible for coordinating research activities across the museum and developing the research strategy. Harry's personal research includes air power history, military culture, armed forces recruitment, and digital history. He has published on the online development of the MOD and armed forces. His book, titled Air Power and the Evacuation of Dunkirk, the RAF and Luftwaffe during Operation Dynamo, based on his PhD thesis, will be published this year. We move on to Dr. Peter Johnston. He's Head of Collections Research and Academic Access at the National Army Museum. As the museum's senior military historian, Peter is responsible for managing and curating exhibitions, developing research strategies, working with partners in academia and the Army, and supporting the museum's public program. Peter led the development of the museum's new fabulous permanent galleries, which opened in 2017. Most recently, Peter has published an authorized history of the British military's time in Germany since 1945, entitled British Forces in Germany, The Lived Experience. Dr. George Hay is the official historian of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. His PhD thesis focused on the social history of the yeomanry cavalry at war and in peace, a subject that has also provided the basis of a number of his publications. His primary research interests include the composition, organization, and function of the armies of the British Empire and the legacies of the two world wars in the form of memorials, war graves, and landscapes. He's also engaged with research relating to the establishment and work of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, particularly variations in the way in which it is commemorated its casualties. Nick Hewitt is Head of Collections and Research at the National Museum of the Royal Navy. Nick joined the Imperial War Museum in 1995, and between 2003 and 2007 was permanent historian on board HMS Belfast. In 2010, he left to become the Head of Collections at Explosion Museum of Naval Firepower in Priddy's Heart, Gosport. He has been with the NMRN since July 2017. Nick is also a regular contributor to television and radio, so many of you have seen him on TV in the BBC presentation Coast, and most recently as part of the presenting team for the BBC's Jutland 1916, the Navy's Bloodiest Day. His books include Firing on Fortress Europe, HMS Belfast and D-Day, Coastal Convoys 1939 to 1945, The Indestructible Highway, and the Kaiser's Pirates, hunting Germany's raiding cruisers. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to this panel. Thank you for being here today. And let's kick off this session. Maybe I can start with asking all of you one by one to just tell me why, very briefly, why this session, why it's important to commemorate this war in the Far East. Maybe we can start with Nick.
Yeah, of course. I think it's super important to commemorate the war in the Far East, because from the naval perspective, the commitment to the war in the Far East is absolutely vast. Both at the beginning, when the Royal Navy suffers appalling casualties and is kind of driven out of Asia, but actually in those last 3 months of the war, when in Europe we tend to think of the war being over, the Royal Navy assembles the single biggest concentration of force in its history to go and form the British Pacific Fleet and join the fight in those last 3 months against Japan, taking the war right up to the Japanese home islands. So it's a huge commitment by hundreds of thousands of people and thousands of ships that is largely overlooked. In fact, one of the best known histories of that campaign is called the Forgotten Fleet. So for me, that something on such a huge scale that is so important strategically, militarily, and politically absolutely must be remembered and discussed.
Mm-hmm. Peter?
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, very similar to Nick, really. The contributions of the army in the war in the Far East, I think, are enormous and fundamental, really, to establishing victory for Britain overall in the war. As you said in your introduction, you know, there is a whole new war, there is a whole different war going on in the Far East beyond that, which is taking place in Europe. And really, I think there's three main reasons why we need to commemorate and celebrate this victory and the contributions of those who fought there. The first is the nature of that victory. You know, this not only was this an enormous, incredible victory, but this is an incredible turnaround for the army. You know, having been driven out of most of Britain's Far East colonial possessions in 1941 and 1942, to be able to completely rebuild that army and turn it into this efficient, victorious fighting machine is no mean feat. It's an incredible triumph of arms. And Slim's own words about defeat into victory are extremely apt. And therefore, I think that is certainly one of the reasons we should do it. Secondly, is the scale and duration of this conflict. You know, the war in Burma, for example, this is the longest single campaign the army fights in the Second World War. And that alone makes it worthy of remembrance. It's fought in some of the harshest terrain against probably one of the most ruthless enemies the British Army's ever fought. And so those alone, which I can unpack a bit later, but those alone too. And finally, I think it's the makeup of the people that fight this army. You know, this is we all know about Slim perhaps, but actually the real story about here, I think, about the war in the Far East is about the soldiers who achieved that victory. You know, there are 40 different nationalities represented in 14th Army. There are allies from China, the United States. There's an enormous contribution from women from the Indian subcontinent. So there's this incredible gender dynamism that takes place as a result of the war. All of which makes this worthy of remembrance, celebration, and commemoration. And I'm really thrilled that we're able to do that today.
Fascinating. Harry, let's hear about the RAF.
Well, I think the war in the Far East is, you know, pivotal to the RAF's history. It's a shame that it's often neglected. Really, air power is instrumental to the successes which happen within Burma. But I think most interesting are the weaknesses which are in place at the start of the campaign and what they reveal about Britain's position in the world. And of course, when the war ends, it doesn't just, you know, operations don't just cease for the RAF. They go on in terms of recovering prisoners of war, but also they take on roles in terms of putting the French back into Vietnam. They have roles in the Netherlands, East Indies. So there's a real range of topics which the RAF sort of, you know, kicks into, which are interesting for Britain's place in the world.
Right. Thanks so much, George. The crucial role of the CWGC after the war ends. Would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, I think with a purely commission hat on, I could say that the war dead deserve our thanks and recognition, whether they lost their lives in Europe, the Far East, or at home, and whether that was in combat, in accident, or due to illness. You know, they each contribute to the final victory, and the collective cause they fought for was a noble one. So their sacrifice must be seen and remembered with total equality. I think looking at this more roundly, I guess there are two important points that are worth remembering about the armies that actually fight in Southeast Asia. And Peter's raised one of them, which is the sheer diversity of Commonwealth forces engaged. And I think the other one is hardship. So many of these men are fighting a long way from home. They're fighting an often brutal war in inhospitable terrain. The suffering of those taken prisoner was horrendous and largely unique. It's obviously one of the most famous aspects of the campaign. So despite the relief that people felt back in May 45 with victory in Europe, it's the forces in the Far East that ultimately deliver the final peace. So it's obviously incredibly important that they get the recognition they deserve. The last thing I wanted to say was, you know, I'm speaking on behalf of an organisation that cares for Commonwealth dead. And this fear sort of really is the Second World War in the eyes of many Australians and Indians, because this was their doorstep. So we shouldn't let our tendency to Eurocentrism allow us to forget that in the discussions.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let's thank you for that roundup. So let's get straight in and tackle all these points that you've raised. All of you have raised. So let's get the timeline. This war in the Far East starts a little later than the one in Europe, obviously. September 1940 is when Japan invades Indochina, and we get in. Following that, it's Singapore. We have 1941. We have Pearl Harbor, and of course we have Singapore, Malaysia, etc. So let's start with the army, Peter, if that's okay. What can you tell us about the deployment of the army in the Far East, and how distracting or difficult was it for them to come through when the war in Europe is also raging? So give us a picture of what it was like.
Yeah, and I think this exactly sums up that point about whilst the war in Europe is raging. The troops who are fighting in the Far East at this stage are pretty much probably the third in a list of priorities where the British Army can only really cater to the top two. And there are very famous defeats at places like Singapore, for example. The defeat out of Burma when the Japanese drive the British from Burma there, and the British are forced into a 1,000-mile retreat, which is essentially the equivalent of walking from Birmingham to Rome. These defeats and retreats really mark a low point of British military strength at arms. Troops that bear the brunt of that are actually troops from the Commonwealth and the former Empire, which creates a bit of a negative aspersion which is cast over them and their performance. But Britain is very much on the back foot. They're dealing with an enemy they've not fought before, but is incredibly ruthless. One the British have simply underestimated for a great cost, which shows throughout 1941 and 1942. But they're also dealing with minimal equipment, and there's just simply no parity in what they've got. The Indian Army as is in 41, 42, which is the bulk of the forces who are out there. They are working with equipment that's near obsolete. They've got poor tactics. They don't have full integration of air power. Harry can talk a little bit more about the air power shortly. But there's a question really also about what the army is actually there to do, even in the war in Far East. If defensive policy in the Far East is basically built on fleet to Singapore, which I'm sure Nick will elaborate more on. The question is, what is the army for? If it's there just to guard air bases, are the air bases in the right place? There's a rather cutting comment that the RAF only builds them where it's convenient and social, rather than necessarily where it's strategically relevant. But all of these things come to play in with the army. And I think one of the sort of the key stats about this is when you look at how the Japanese move and how they fight, they're very quick, they're excellent at maneuver, they've got great integration with armor and air power. The British simply don't have that. And also what the Japanese have is they have an incredible level of firepower. They have 3 automatic weapons per section, for example, and the Indian Army at this stage only has 1, and it's a Lewis gun, which is a First World War weapon.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
So that is what is up against. And these defeats and retreats are disasters. In many ways, I think they're inevitable because of the lack of resources that are available to put into the British. But it certainly sets the tone, which ultimately makes the victory in 1945 all the more remarkable.
Absolutely. So Harry, the RAF is sort of facing more or less the same problems, aren't they? At this time, the Japanese Air Force is a superior force than what you have in India or, in that region at this moment.
Yeah, absolutely. The RAF's been undersupplied in the years building up to it, despite sort of urgent appeals for more modern aircraft. There's around 150 in Singapore and Malaya. None of them can really be considered modern aircraft. And indeed, some of them are close to antiquated. And partly the reason that resupply was difficult is because, as Peter says, it's the end of a long chain. Russia gets hurricanes before the Malaysian theatre. So that's inevitably going to impact on the resources available. But more than that, there's an underappreciation of the skills and strengths of the Japanese Army Air Force, which takes the fight into Malaysia and then Singapore, and then subsequently Burma. Their planes are better than we expected. Their pilots are exceptionally talented at this point in the war, and really they're able to outfight the RAF, except when the RAF is able to make real advantage of height and speed in the air fighting. So for air power, the interesting aspect is, why was it under-resourced? And then in the retreat during Burma, what's fascinating is seeing small instances of those aspects which go on to allow victory happen later in the war. So we see air resupply happen in the retreat. Huge amounts of resources getting brought into Rangoon, and then non-combatants brought out. Really interesting aspects of the use and versatility of the Air Force, which, as I say, go on be crucial in 1944 and then 1945.
Mm-hmm. So, Nick, what is happening with the Navy at this time? Because they are fighting in Germany and, they've got enough on their hands. What is happening on the Far East front?
So for the Navy, it's a similar tale of woe. And there are some interesting points that I think the others have raised that are worth just reiterating. Underestimation of the enemy, I think, is even less forgivable for the Royal Navy, because until comparatively recently, the Royal Navy had been working closely with the Japanese. Certainly at the start of the century, the Royal Navy had helped the Japanese develop their fleet. They fought alongside them in the First World War. Royal Navy observers worked with the Japanese fairly consistently until the interwar period. So they knew the Japanese were good. They had a modern, advanced, vast fleet. So there shouldn't have been any surprises there. And to an extent, there weren't, because the other thing that certainly the Navy is flagging up in their pre-war planning is long before the Second World War has started for Britain, the Royal Navy is saying, we can comfortably handle a war with Germany. We think we can manage a war with Germany and Italy, but a war with Germany, Italy, and a third power, and the most likely third power is Japan, cannot be fought. The Navy just doesn't have the resources to do it. So to an extent, it plays out as they predict. By the time the Japanese war begins, the Royal Navy is fully committed in European waters and in the Mediterranean. And of course, things have got worse there, far worse than the pre-war planners expected, because France has folded. So the Royal Navy doesn't have a French fleet to work alongside in the Mediterranean. So they are chronically overstretched. Then it becomes very similar to the Army and RAF story. The Eastern Fleet, the deployments in the East are hugely under-resourced. There aren't enough ships. With the warships in particular, they don't necessarily have the technological issue. The ships that are out there are probably as good a mix of modern and old ships as the other theatres, but there are far, far too few of them. And so when the war begins, and we've mentioned already that the fall of Singapore and that the catastrophic loss of HMS Repulse and HMS of Prince of Wales, that the whole Singapore strategy is based around having a fleet in Singapore that will deter the Japanese. And by December 1941, that fleet has been reduced to 2 capital ships. There's supposed to be 1 aircraft carrier with them, but the aircraft carrier runs aground and is damaged and can't get there. So all of that planning is reduced to a force that is so small, it would have been better off not being there at all.
Oh dear. And it's ironic, because Britain's imperial power and the empire all rested so much on the Navy. So it's incredible that it didn't have this balance in the Far East.
100%, and that's a consequence of pre-war defence planning and a debate that's incredibly complex, and would be lovely to do one of these on. But people have flagged up that these are issues, but in peacetime the investment just isn't there. The investment has gone into Singapore Naval Base on the assumption that you'll either be fighting in Europe or you'll be fighting in Asia, and if you have a war in Asia, you relocate the fleet there. Nobody wants to think about what happens if we have to do all this at the same time.
Exactly. So which brings me, we go on to the defeats which happened. Of course, Singapore, one of the biggest defeats as Churchill himself described it. How demoralizing was this? Should we go back to Peter? Peter, would you like to tell us what happened there? And how they coped with it? How demoralizing was it basically?
It's interesting, really, because the fall of Singapore is, for all the reasons that Nick has described, essentially, and Harry, essentially inevitable. When the armies fail to do anything like build a fixed line of defences, because it's claimed that defences are bad for morale before the war begins, so they're not built. And once the Japanese make a successful landing, they begin moving down, which they're able to do after the loss of the capital ships, as Nick described. Then really, there's simply no way that the British and the Indians and the Australians who are there can hold them. And then there's examples of poor leadership which compound these errors. But Singapore is a bit of a disaster. And Churchill initially talked about holding Singapore to the last man and all this sort of thing, but pretty soon it becomes inevitable that it's going to fall. Partly, I think, because they underestimate the Japanese, and then also they're so shocked by what the Japanese are able to do, they then begin to overestimate what the Japanese are capable of when they could otherwise fight. But I think some of the most demoralising victories are, when Hong Kong falls on Christmas Day 1941. Hong Kong is very much far and away out there. That is an outlier. It's not really going to be realistically held. The loss of Singapore resonates strongly with British imperial pride, exactly as you say, as a seafaring nation whose defence is built on and prestige is built on the Royal Navy. That's a huge problem, which the army is able to sort of disengage themselves from as being an issue. The big problem for the army is what happens in Burma. And that defeat out of Burma is something that we don't often, when we talk about the forgotten war, actually that defeat out of Burma is something that we forget, the speed at which the Japanese do. And the Japanese are fighting some pretty comprehensive and good and a good army in the Burma Corps. The Burma Corps is probably more effective than the troops that the British have in Malaya at the same period. Right. And the way that is driven back and forced into this humiliating and really savage retreat causes a huge blow of prestige, but more importantly, it creates a huge amount of anxiety because suddenly India is threatened. India is being threatened by invasion. This is something that the British haven't faced for hundreds of years. And there's a very realistic chance that the Japanese might be able to achieve it. And so this is what begins to provoke this huge reprioritization of resources, and something that hadn't been made to go without for so long. It's becoming more obvious that actually the Indian army needs to be reinforced. Some of the better units and the divisions who are fighting in North Africa by this stage are recalled. And all of this begins to take place and ramp up, and means that the British are going to be able to, the British and their Indian allies are going to be able to hold the line when the inevitable Japanese invasion comes.
Right. So, Harry, what's happening with the RAF? I mean, at this time, they don't even have airfields. They're, as you said, less equipped. The Navy's been attacked. The Army's on retreat. What's going on with the Air Force?
Well, obviously, you can't just turn a tap and have all of the equipment that you need. And importantly, the aircrew who are of a good enough quality to engage with the Japanese. So Hurricanes are rushed out. They're of an older mark, so their performance isn't as good, particularly in tropical theatres. But importantly, they have to be rushed into service. So you see them used quite piecemeal. And again, aircrew quality, there are some experienced pilots mixed in, but a lot who are quite raw. And so you're facing an experienced enemy, and that makes combat quite challenging. And it's not really drilled into them, but what they need to do is not engage in dogfighting against a more maneuverable aircraft type, but instead use the advantages of dive and zoom tactics. So really, the sort of nitty-gritty parts of military training come into this. Right. But more than anything, again, we see that sort of underappreciation of just how good the Japanese are. And so there's an element of the tactics being wrong, a counter-force strategy which isn't suitable for the number of aircraft that the RAF have, which ultimately leads to taking heavy losses both on the ground and in the air, and having to pull back into India during that retreat. Right. As we touched on some of the air transport issues which happened during the retreat, really important. But I think the early period of war against Japan is one where the RAF gets a bit of a lashing and has to learn its lessons.
Right. So Nick, we've already mentioned the fall of the sinking of HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse. These are hugely demoralizing. Excuse me. These are hugely demoralizing. How does the Navy, counter this, and what is the thinking going on now? What is the next step they're going to take?
They are hugely demoralizing, and also whilst we're here to talk about the war in the Far East, I think it's important to remember that all this happens in a wider context, and for the Royal Navy in particular, that wider context is a war that's going pretty badly anyway. So this comes hard on the heels of some fairly catastrophic losses to ships in the Mediterranean. The Navy has been mauled off Crete earlier in 1941. So it's just this constant cycle of things going badly. Prince of Wales and Repulse, I think that there is a strong feeling that this is a consequence of that underestimation that anyone, and by anyone really, I think we have to hold up Winston Churchill to a very strong extent, thinks that the Japanese Navy can be deterred by two ships. It's just a ridiculous concept that just doesn't hold up. And again, the individual that is sent in command of it is a staff officer fundamentally, Tom Phillips. Was he the right man for that job? There's a little bit of a sense of giving someone a tryout in a command afloat that he hadn't previously had. So there's a huge amount of hubris, I think, in the way that the Navy performs out there. And yes, they're pitted against, so they're exhausted by 2 years of war. They're inadequately resourced. The Japanese have trained and trained and trained and trained. Their carrier aviation in particular is the best in the world. They have the best carrier fighter. The navalized Zero fighter is better than anyone else has got up. Their training is fantastic. They've had years and years of pre-war training and live combat experience in China, which is an ideal theatre to train, because it's proper combat training, but it's against an enemy that is fairly defeatable, so they can work up their skills in that way. And I think it's very, very telling, certainly in the case of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor against the Americans. Rumours fly around that these aircraft have been flown by Germans, because nobody is willing to accept the fact that the Japanese have done this to us. So it takes the Navy a lot of time to pick up its feet and to get back on its game, and it doesn't have time to think. So the Singapore disaster is followed rapidly by disasters off Indonesia. They are driven further and further west. Nagumo's carriers raid through the Indian Ocean, and the Eastern Fleet, which is still basically very old ships, has to run to the African coast and operate out of East Africa for a while. So it's just this constant, they never have an opportunity to settle, build up their force again, and kind of get their confidence back until many, many months after. So it's all bad news initially.
Sure. So let's go on to the...
Shrabani, can I just jump in? Because I think there's something we haven't mentioned, which is we've spoken about this idea of demoralization, but I think I'm right in saying that the Japanese offensive through Southeast Asia capture somewhere in the region of 190,000 Allied servicemen. There might even be Commonwealth servicemen, and 80,000 of those are captured at Singapore alone when it acquiesces, when it puts up the flag. So immediately that's a demoralizing issue. It's also a humiliating defeat. But it has a legacy, which I guess we'll come round to. But for those who end up as prisoners, who then spend the rest of their war in captivity, it's tough.
Can I just jump in and just quickly add to that as well? You're right. And what makes it worse is that because of what we know, and we'll talk about later about the conditions for prisoners of war in the Far East and all that, they just disappear, those people, for a long, long time. There isn't the process through the Red Cross and all that to find out what's happened to them. They just disappear. And it's months and months before anyone knows whether they're alive or dead or what's happened to them. And that's even worse for morale. I mean, it's the shock, isn't it?
Yeah, the Japanese never ratified the 1929 Geneva Conventions on prisoners of war. So
exactly. So let's talk about the pushback now, the fight back. So they've entered through Burma, they've reached India, and we're going to have the famous Battle of Kohima, which is the turning point. So Peter, some good news and some bad news. What happens in Kohima, this famous battle, the Battle of the Tennis Court and others? Tell us about it.
Yeah, so the battles at Kohima and Imphal really sort of mark the high water of the Japanese advance. This is the invasion of India. And what the Japanese are doing is they're trying to drive into Manipur and essentially liberate the resources that they're going to need to then advance further into India. Alongside this, they're preparing an enormous propaganda effort to basically swing the opinion of the local population onto their side, to effectively say this is your chance to throw off your colonial oppressors. They already have the Indian National Army that is working alongside them, and so this is another crisis point, I think, that the army faces down. Now, what the army has already done, actually, by this stage, though, in February 1944, which I think is significant, is they've won the Battle of the Admin Box in the Arakan in February. And that is really the first time they've shown the Japanese can be beaten. The British have taken a lot of casualties doing this, absolutely. But they've fought on ground where they've tried to fight before. They've pushed the Japanese. And whereas the Japanese, as I was mentioning earlier, are very good at maneuver, they're very good at cutting round, chopping supply routes, and then forcing the British to withdraw. What they've pioneered by this stage, and actually with the aid of the RAF, which Harry's already alluded to, is this concept of air supply. And this idea being that if the army could just hold its ground and be supplied from the air, they can fight the Japanese to a standstill. Because while the Japanese are very good fighters, they move very quickly, they have no real logistical chain at all, and they can't sustain themselves. So if you could hold them and fight them, you can then essentially win and begin to force them back. The RAF are absolutely essential to that. And the RAF are essential to that at Imphal and Kohima as well, between March and July. I think, Imphal in particular, the RAF flying an entire division. The 5th Indian Division is brought in to reinforce that garrison very quickly. And at that stage, in Imphal with the hills surrounding it, it's limited by roads, and so all the Japanese attacks need to come down various ways. But the British are able to stand there, hold and fight. And then there's the incredible courage at Kohima as well. Again, the famous tennis court that we know that we know so much about. And from this stage, then suddenly the Japanese are beaten. Suddenly the Japanese are going backwards. And all right, the monsoon then begins and breaks, but the British are able to get across the Irrawaddy, which is very important and significant, and they're already able to begin to mount the counterattack. And what you see in that stage of 1944 is essentially the success of 18 months since the British were driven out of Burma, which is put in purely into training. And it's transformed the armies in India. And jungle training, morale has been raised after the catastrophic defeats. And then as with many things, you know, sort of the converse of what Nick was describing when it was defeat, victory enhances its own morale.
So the tide starts turning. And Harry, I want you to, tell us about the crucial role of the RAF, which Peter's already referred to, because of the terrain. So I was reading about, this famous Battle of the Tennis Court where supplies were cut off. So they had no water. They were down to a pint of water a day per soldier, and food was cut off. So the RAF had to drop these supplies. And because the terrain was so hilly, sometimes it would go into the Japanese side. So how much of a challenge was this, and how did they sustain this under these circumstances?
I mean, it's a huge challenge because the terrain, of course, is as difficult to fly over as it is to fight through. And the resupply of Kohima had to go down the entire length of a valley where small arms fire regularly hold Dakotas. It's surprising more weren't lost. Fortunately, the nature of the Japanese advance means that anti-aircraft heavy weaponry can't be brought. It's mainly limited to machine gun use. But I have to agree with Peter, the admin box battle is really important because, first of all, it demonstrates that air resupply is going to be really effective. The 62nd Squadron basically keeps the West African regiment fighting into the admin box, which is a really interesting aspect of it. The Arakan offensive. And huge numbers of supplies go in there. And then Kohima and Imphal, I think 19,000 tons of supplies, 12,000 men. Mountbatten initially welcomed the Japanese advance. This is the chance to really better the Japanese. They've overextended. And in a way, that's true. But if it hadn't been possible to keep those key positions resupplied, then India's open. And initially, those positions aren't held by frontline troops. They have to be rushed in by air supply. Sometimes 5 sorties a day by Dakota aircrew. Really taxing effort. And it's vital to stopping this Japanese advance. So it's fascinating to see how it sort of unfolds.
I think just to add to what Harry said, what's also really key about what's being flown in is what the army themselves are prioritising to be flown out. So they basically evacuate, knowing that these places are going to come under siege. They basically evacuate effectively all non-combatants from these areas, so they don't have to worry about feeding them. So they can effectively turn these places into absolute fortresses that are geared purely towards fighting, and that becomes really key. That level of pragmatism that's applied to what the army's doing, and the women of the Women's Auxiliary Service in Burma, the WASBs, they're flown out of Imphal actually relatively late, but that constant interflow of supplies and prioritization and just pragmatism about turning this into a warfighting machine is ultimately what wins the day, I think.
I would also just add to that if you look at the operations on the Arakan coast, we mustn't forget the small craft of the Royal Indian Navy either, who are performing exactly the same function. They're allowing the army to move along the coast, knowing that their supplies are secure. And this is small ships and small craft. It's a coastal navy in things like Fairmile B motor launches that are working absolutely intimately with the military formations ashore to keep them leapfrogging along the coast there.
So I'm going to go back to Peter to just give me an idea of who was now masterminding, this whole operation. Tell us about the role of General Slim and the 14th Army, as you mentioned before briefly. This composite band of so many nationalities fighting together. How did the logistics work? I mean, it's a fascinating army by itself.
It is, and again, this is one of the real triumphs of this campaign. This ultimately the 14th Army evolved to become the largest Commonwealth Army Britain's ever put into the field. It's got nearly 1 million soldiers in it. I've mentioned 40 nationalities, but they've got 30 different ration scales. So all that air supply and pressure that's been put on the RAF to bring all those things in. Although increasingly, recent scholarship has actually shown that we talk about this a lot, but recent scholarship has shown that some of the soldiers, closer they get to the front line, the more the campaign goes on, and the more professional they become, they simply eat what's available. And they become less sensitive to those sorts of things, which I think speaks to the overall professionalization of this force and the way in which they've become experts in their craft, and the level of transformation from from defeat into victory in this is something that I don't think the British Army has ever done before. We often talk about the way in which the British Army was able to recover from near catastrophic defeat in the First World War, and obviously George knows a huge amount about this as well. After the Spring Offensive and turn that round and begin to mount the 100 days. But this is even more impressive. This is the end of a huge logistical chain. This is completely revolutionised how that army fights. It's pioneered new tactics. And a lot of that's been driven by Mountbatten, who's been appointed Supreme Commander of Southeast Asian Command, but also by Slim, as you mentioned there. And Slim has really taken over 14th Army, and he's begun to craft it into exactly what he wants. He's professionalised it, he's trained it, and Slim was a great leader of men in the way that he could appeal to ordinary soldiers as well as his sort of junior commanders. And the way that he crafted and built and rewarded excellence without hindering it. He made several tough decisions where he let some of his valued subordinates go off and take promotions to contribute to the war effort elsewhere than just stay with him. And all these are the marks of superb leadership. And it's no real surprise that he is probably Britain's greatest ever general, I think. And that certainly contributes to it. But what is interesting is the use and deployment of things like armour in Burma, which someone like General Frank Messervy, who's one of these great, I think, underrated generals of the British Army at this time, he'd been actually, after the war in the desert, he'd been sent back to India with sort of a less than glowing report where they said, well, he's an Indian Army officer, he'll never understand armour, which is essential to modern warfare. And yet then look what he had managed to achieve in Burma. And he totally turned that around. So he certainly proved his doubters wrong, as did all the soldiers under his command who contributed so significantly.
Right. As Mountbatten said, the Battle of Kohima was probably the greatest battle in history. He didn't even say Second World War. And he described it as naked courage. So, that was some fight back.
It was huge. And the stakes were incredibly high. And this was an allied multi-ethnic, diverse contribution to victory, then that can never really be forgotten, and it's something that I think we should celebrate now. The United Nations of 14th Army, actually, I've got to say, looks a lot like Britain today, and the diversity we have in Britain today, and that's why I think it's so important that we can talk about this, because we have all this wonderful shared heritage.
Absolutely, and I'm going to bring George in right here, because this is the third part.
Yeah, I was going to pick up on what Peter said about Slim, because I think whereas someone like Montgomery divided opinion at the time and certainly has done as time has passed, I think Slim is quite universally accepted as being welcomed and loved by his men, and history has, I guess, looked very favourably upon him as a general and as a human being, which is rare and incredibly important out in Southeast Asia. But the other thing, we've spoken about diversity, I think Peter spoke about the size of the Indian Army, but it is the largest volunteer army in the world in 45. Yes. But you've also got, I think, 3 African divisions fighting and 2 independent brigades from East and West Africa, which I think more often than not are completely forgotten and written out of this history, but they're there. And they, as Peter said, it's reflective of diversity within the UK now, but really important that we reflect on everyone who contributed.
Right. So could you tell us some more about what the CWGC is doing to commemorate these?
Well, I mean, at the time or now?
Well, now, because I know there's a lot of rememorialization. Many names were not mentioned. Is there an attempt now, and especially now, given against the background of Black Lives Matter, all this becomes all the more important. So I'd love to hear about what plans there are, because many names have been lost. There was so many fighting there, women. They're not all listed as, in other memorials there are. What is being done for the future for this?
That's a difficult question to answer, because arguably the Commission will stand and say that everyone is treated with complete equality in death. So if a name was held and passed to the Commission, it would be either used and placed on a headstone, which would be over the burial, and if the burial was not recognised or if the body was never recovered, somebody would go, or the day would be chiseled into a memorial to the missing. In terms of oversights and omissions, we are aware that there are some, and it is an ongoing effort that the Commission is involved in rooting those out, and if we can find those names, then obviously making sure that they are added to those memorials or burials if it's possible. And if that's impossible, then looking forwards, we're likely to start thinking about new ways in which we can share what history there is that remains with those communities who were involved, to really raise the profile of those contributions.
Right. Oh, fantastic. So Harry, I'm going to bring you in here, because the RAF, they say that it was the forgotten force of the forgotten campaign. So how harsh is that, and what is being done to right that wrong?
Yeah, I think that's quite true. It's been neglected to an extreme extent, which is a shame, because it's a wonderful story. And not only the RAF, there's within the RAF, there's multi-ethnicity from the Commonwealth. But so there's 1,000 Australians in 1944 fighting within the RAF itself. The Royal Australian Air Force is fighting elsewhere. But as well as that, very strong collaborations with allies. The Americans leap to mind immediately. Whilst the special relationship is often tense politically, the air forces collaborate very effectively. And we've talked about Impala and Kohina. I think there's no greater demonstration of the way that extra transport aircraft were made available, the flexibility which manoeuvred around. But the Indian Air Force, which, under the Royal Indian Air Force by the end of the war, demonstrates just how professional it is from the very start. It goes in using Lysanders, which they've equipped with wooden wheels, because the Lysander has a tendency to blow its tyre at the back, to the amazement of RAF crews, who immediately, want to get that adaptation for themselves. They convert this aircraft, which is pretty ropey, to undertake bombing in support of both the army and against the Japanese. By the end of the Second World War, they've got 9 squadrons. And I think it's got to be recognised, but we haven't done a good enough job at collecting those stories within our archives. They're an amazing collection out there, which is, you have to think, waiting for people to share it. And we've not been good enough at listening and encouraging people to come forward with those stories. And I hope that for this anniversary, that's what happens. If people have got stories of serving with the RAF or the Indian Air Force, which they want to share with us, I'd be delighted to hear them.
I think one name comes to my mind is Jumbo Mazumdar, who was he's quite a hero back in India. So he was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, and it was I think he was in the Far East campaign. So he was he's it would be good to know more about all these people in the future. And but also crucially, the RAF continued its work after the war as well, isn't it? They were doing crucial work even post-war.
So VJ Day doesn't see the end of the RAF undertaking operations. There's an immediate need to bring supplies to prisoner of war camps, internees, occupied areas, and then evacuate prisoners of war. And obviously that's crucial. One of the most harrowing stories I've come across is a group of prisoners of war who have just been loaded onto an aircraft and repatriated, delighted to be getting home, which crashes on takeoff, killing everyone, including the aircrew. This is post-war. And, there's a huge number of sorties which continue on, and the RAF itself is hard worked. It goes on to operate in Thailand, Vietnam, Java, these sort of areas. But in India, the aircrew which are there, often undertaking repair work on transports, not all of which are military, haven't been demobilised, and it leads to what's effectively a mutiny, politically, more politely termed a strike. And that's a really fascinating aspect of the RAF's time in India, that this recruited service, which is often more democratically minded, has aircrews who, having been inspired by American actions in Europe, it seems, decided they've had enough. They're going to go home. They want to press their requests for urgent release. And of course, we then see mutinies, which are named that by the Royal Indian Navy.
Yes.
Strikes by the Royal Indian Air Force. So, it's a really interesting time for the RAF.
Of course, yeah. So I'm going to ask Nick, because it's a similar story with the Navy, isn't it, Nick? They stay on even after the war, playing a crucial role.
Yeah, can we just backtrack a bit, because we've basically run straight through the entire British Pacific Fleet, which I'd quite like to rewind.
Yeah, of course.
Because that story of success is obviously really important here. The Navy comes back into Asian waters when it's ready. When the war in Europe is starting to wind down, when the German Navy is defeated, the best of the Royal Navy's ships and men go out to gear up to join the war in the Far East after a long political struggle with the Americans, who frankly don't really want the British there. And this involves a complete reworking of how the Royal Navy fights its wars. And I think it's really important we remember that what they have to do in the Pacific in particular, the scale of the operations, the distances, the fact that this is a carrier war against a very experienced naval foe, even if it is one that's kind of on the back foot, requires the Navy to completely rethink. All the lessons they've learned fighting Germans and Italians are almost all worthless. So they have to learn how to do this again. They have to learn how to take their supply service with them. The British improvised this fleet train of support ships that is quite an extraordinary achievement. I think historians tend to focus on its limitations and the problems with it, but actually it works. There are some very squeaky moments for the British in terms of supply, and undoubtedly at the front line they have to lean on the Americans rather more than the politicians intended them to, but it still works. So this vast force of a huge number of aircraft carriers at the heart of it works its way through. It's worked up in combat conditions, attacking bypassed German installations in Indonesia, and then it joins the war at the end for the Okinawa campaign, and then for the raids on the Japanese homeland that characterized the end of the war. So this huge force is there, accepting its junior role, and that's quite hard. The Americans are very much in control in the Pacific. The British are there as a junior partner, but they perform a key role. American admirals are very, very complimentary about their performance and the job they do. And then you're absolutely right. The war ends, and there's this sudden jolt, because on the one hand, the politicians in London want to disband the British Pacific Fleet as soon as possible. It's a very, very expensive resource operating on the other side of the world, and Britain is broke by this point. But there is still loads for them to do. We've already heard about the evacuation of prisoners of war, former prisoners of war and internees. The Navy are doing that in spades. Aircraft carriers are converted almost overnight into huge transports to bring back internees and ex-POWs. They fill the hangar decks basically with bunk beds. In a mission the Americans call Operation Magic Carpet, rather lovingly. So that's the way they bring them out. They're also involved, the BPF is split into small task forces incredibly quickly. So one is sent to Hong Kong, for example, to both take the surrender of Japanese forces there, evacuate internees and prisoners of war, bring in what today we call humanitarian aid, humanitarian relief. They're involved in picking up isolated Japanese garrisons from all over the place and bringing them back to Japan.
Right.
So the work for the sailors is huge, and it's carried out against a backdrop of shrinking resource, because what the government want to do is get these ships back to the UK, get them paid off, and get the crews demobilised as soon as possible. So it's incredibly busy for the fleet, and that in part explains why the British presence in Tokyo Bay is quite small, because they have lots and lots of other things to do.
Right. How interesting.
I think, sorry, Sharon, there's also an interesting point there, which I think applies to all the services at this stage, which is, I don't actually think, very few people actually expect the war against Japan to end in August 1945.
Yeah.
That does actually come as a complete surprise. You know, but by this stage, the British have actually withdrawn 14th Army from Burma to prepare for the invasion of Malaya, which is seen as the far more overarching strategic goal. In Europe, they're training troops, getting ready for the eventual invasion of Japan. They're already beginning to making discussions about what the British land forces' contribution of that is going to be. So, in some ways, that the Japanese surrender and the end of the war takes them a little bit by surprise. And then, exactly as Nick and Harry have said, likewise, the army are pressed into various things, including at some stages fighting alongside the Japanese to defeat communist guerrillas in some former colonial possessions.
Right.
Can I just add to that as well? Sorry, on the Malaya question. The really fascinating thing for me about that is that's going to be an amphibious landing. So that involves the Navy as well. The Navy is preparing for that, Operation Zipper. And it's so far advanced that actually the most practical way to get liberation forces, if you want to call them that, into Malaya when the war has ended is still to carry out that amphibious landing. So in effect, they invade Malaya against no enemy, because the troops are ready to go, the landing craft are ready to go, everyone's ready to go. Let's just send them over.
Let's send them, right. So which brings me, we're sort of running out of time here. So I'm going to bring George back, because this is now the end of the war, and the harrowing task of now finding the prisoners of war, the conditions they are in. How is this managed? I mean, we know that the Air Force and the Navy, we've had, they are the ones flying them out, but tell us a little bit about how, how they discovered them, and then how they discovered the atrocities, because Japan hadn't followed the Geneva Convention, so they were tortured, they were starved. Just tell us a little bit about that part of the history.
As I think Nick said earlier, that there is little known. There is some information that has obviously leaked out, some communication that has come out during the war, but for lots of people, families, nothing is heard, and so where husbands, fathers, brothers are is unknown until liberation. And in some cases, they don't really have a full number for missing lists, so those who are dead for whom they can't identify a body until those repatriations start. So that's when you start seeing the gaps, because where are these men there unaccounted for? But what it does do is introduce or start this process of then looking for the dead. And this goes on for a long time, because the conditions in the Far East present a number of unique issues that they haven't, or the Army Graves Service, as it is, that performs these tasks, it hasn't faced in Europe as such. So you have these commonalities where war in the 20th century is very violent. It is very dangerous, for want of a better term. And what it means is that, though we don't want to dwell on it, the devastation of modern weapons can mean that bodies are not recoverable. The chaos of battle means that many men are lost. And when you then look at Southeast Asia and you start thinking about retreats through mountainous jungle terrain, it's no surprise that huge quantities of men who are killed on those retreats or die of disease, even if they're buried by their comrades, that their place of burial is never found. So that's one issue. The other issue, as you've alluded to, Shrabani, is the mistreatment of prisoners of war. So we could go into that in great detail, but we don't have time. But if you look at the Thai-Burma Railway and other infrastructure projects that the Japanese put prisoner of war labour do, where they feed them on very limited rations and work them exceedingly hard, they have no access to medical provision, really. And so their rates of death are enormous. And these are the men we talked about earlier who are being, captured at Singapore and elsewhere. And if it is something strung out like the railway operations, those men are going to be buried haphazardly along the line of that, along the line of the railway. And sometimes they would be as formalised as they were allowed to cemeteries in places where they were in base camps, but in lots of cases it's simply not happening. So you can read accounts into the late 40s and I think even early 50s where you have Army Graves Service units who are going into the jungle on elephant back because they cannot go through the trails because it's so overgrown. It's the nature of jungle. And they're using information that has been passed to them by prisoners of war, where they have identified possible places of burials and cemeteries. And their work is basically to find those bodies and to concentrate them, which is a commission word, which basically means to exhume and bring them into permanent cemeteries. And yeah, you're looking at hundreds of thousands across the theatre. But in many cases, obviously, it's impossible to do that. And that's later on when those cemeteries are handed over on agreed sites that they, with what was at the time the Imperial War Graves Commission. And they concentrate those burials into those places. The commission then takes over, and then you move on to the process of building the memorials. And there are any number of them, but Rangoon is to pick one as a good example. So you've got the names of 26,800 Commonwealth servicemen on Rangoon. And that's primarily those who die in the campaigns in Burma to 41 to 45. These are men who have no known graves. So sometimes, if it's in Taucan War Cemetery, in which you have, I think, 860 men who were buried unknown. So they'll have a headstone that bears the inscription "Known unto God." But they didn't know who that man was. Now, arguably, in all likelihood, if everything's gone correctly, those names are part of that 26,800, but that leaves an awful lot whose bodies were never recovered. And I think that shows you or gives you an idea of the scale of, first of all, like the ferocity of the fighting and how costly it was on a human level, but also these really quite unique issues that are faced in Southeast Asia. And I was going to talk about these commonalities that you have there, but actually there's probably more commonalities with Southeast Asia to just certain aspects or elements of the First World War, where the nature of fighting is similarly violent, and the contested ground doesn't allow you to recover the dead during the war, which means if the attempts to do so afterwards are made that much harder.
Sure. So thank you all. I was just wondering, before we end the session, would you all like to just summarize, what you take away from here, and, come back to why this is so important to remember the 75th anniversary of VJ Day? So let's start with you, Peter.
Yeah, thanks. So I think for us, this is a triumph of arms that's built on the incredible hard work of the ordinary people who fought there. And those people came from different nations, different parts of the world. And in many ways, this really represents why we refer to the Second World War as the Second World War. These were people that crossed oceans, they crossed mountains, they crossed deserts, all to stand and fight alongside Britain. And I think we should also remember the Japanese who fought as well. And from our perspective, the National Army Museum, yes, while we like talking about people like Slim, Britain's greatest ever general, really this is a victory won by the ordinary people on the ground and doing all the support work back. And actually, I'm just going to close with a quick quote from George MacDonald Fraser, who actually fought in Burma himself. And he said, "If mankind is lucky, it may be that the end of the Burma campaign was the last great battle in the last great war. And even if it wasn't, it may still be worth remembering from an ordinary foot soldier's point of view."
Lovely. Thank you so much. Nick, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I think for me, it was very interesting. Just as an aside, I have to get this quip in, obviously, that Britain's greatest general, but it was a sailor that they put in charge of it all in Southeast Asia Command. So it wouldn't be me if I didn't get that across. I think it's the consistency of the experience, really, that initial triumph against adversity, and the very, very different nature of the war, both in terms of the physical hardships, the unique nature of the enemy they faced, the geographical distances. I think that is what stands out for me. Peter's already alluded to it, really. The Second World War is a world war. And for me, it's that campaign right across the Far East and Asia is what makes it a world war. This is not a European war. This is a world war that involves a truly international cast and is spread right across the globe. And actually, if anything, it's I mean, we could debate this for months, but if anything, it's the campaign in the Far East that makes the Second World War more of a truly global conflict than the First World War, actually, because of the scale and effort required out there. So yeah, I mean, it's been a fascinating experience, and I really look forward to the questions.
All right. Harry, would you like to go next?
The thing I'd like to take away from this is that the reason the war in the East is so neglected is partly because it's so complicated. It's easy to talk about the war in Europe. The war in Burma, where independence is won only a short time later. The same with India, where we go on to see air supply basically being a prelude of a lot of the tactics which are used in a more modern sense in Vietnam. Again, independence won there subsequently. I think there's so much we haven't touched upon. We could have talked about air superiority for the RAF, or going along the roads of the Army's advance spraying DDT. There's a huge variation in what the RAF accomplishes. And essentially, it is essential to the victories that the other services win. And it is as multi-ethnic as those other services, which is often forgotten about the RAF.
Sure. Right. George, would you like to conclude?
I think naturally I'll go reflective and say that those who returned as victors from the fighting found a nation sort of already attempting to move on, and the jubilation to some extent already burned out following victory in Europe. So their exploits in Southeast Asia were in many ways overshadowed by the defeat of what was always considered to be the main foe. So I think we should now ensure that we give them the recognition they deserve, and make that a priority going forwards.
Thank you so much. That's been a wonderful session, and we'll be back for questions. Thank you. Hello, everybody, and welcome back. We've got lots and lots of questions to get through today. But just before I start taking all your questions, I just want to make one point. Today, 15th of August, is Independence Day, and this came exactly 2 years after the war. So the war and everything that happened there then led to the, sort of escalated the freedom struggle. And, India was independent and partitioned, as we know. So, that's something to keep in mind, and I'm sure it will come up in the questions as well. But let's get straight in. So Judith asks, my father was in the Royal Signals and left Freetown for Burma with the 82nd West African Division. I sent for his army records, but no mention of his service there. Does anybody know how I can find out what he did there? He, like many, never spoke about it, apart from saying that he spent some time in Rangoon. So is there somebody who can answer this, Harry?
If he's working, if he's with the army, I can jump in and put on. I used to work at the National Archives. If you want records relating to operational type materials, that's where you need to go. I would be surprised if there wasn't some mention on that army service record of some attachment to a West African division. You may find it's written in such a way that is difficult to interpret. So I don't know if Peter and Nam can help on that front, but you may even find that someone at the National Archives can. But if you want to understand what the unit was doing within the division, then it's war diaries, and the war diaries are held at the National Archives at Kew.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd also just to add to what George has said. Obviously, the majority of the official resources and records are kept there, but also it's worth contacting the Regimental Museum of the Royal Signals as well, which is in Blandford, because they may well have they may well have a muster roll or something like that, or a list or basic details relating to his service, or they might have someone who served alongside him or with him at the same sort of dates, and these sorts of things you can often use to sort of piece together and colour a bit more some of the more very basic functional usual information you get in service records, and they just tend to add a bit more colour to the situation.
So the next question, Tim asks, the naval aspect seems to focus on the US Navy, whereas the British involvement seems to be in the shadow of the loss of Prince of Wales and the repulse. Has this affected the appreciation of the Royal Navy's role later in the war academically? We did cover this, Nick, but yeah.
I think yes, it has. I think not so much academically. I think academic naval historians have always been very aware of the significance of the BPF contribution, particularly at the end of the war. But certainly in terms of popular understanding, I think it's hugely overlooked beyond Prince of Wales and repulse, and not just the Pacific Fleet either, but the operations in the Indian Ocean, the contribution of the Commonwealth navies. I mean, the Australians are fighting alongside the Americans throughout, even if it's only a few ships sometimes, as are the New Zealanders. So yeah, I would agree with it in terms of popular memory. I think probably there are some good books around. David Hobbs actually has just written one about the British Pacific Fleet that's absolutely extraordinary, but it's a niche audience for it. I think that's probably fair to say. Equally, we must remember in due deference, although we all want to fight the British corner here today, the American contribution at sea is huge. And although I've spoken repeatedly about the size of the British Pacific Fleet relative to the size of the US Pacific Fleet that it joins, it's tiny, it's a mere task force. The Americans have geared up to fight their way across the Pacific, island hopping, taking everything with them, with vast forces of warships and supply ships and support vessels, and so it is an American story. We mustn't deprive them of that, but maybe the British corner of it is not as well told as it should be.
Mm-hmm. So Ewan asks, to what extent was Japanese air-ground integration mentioned as a key issue, a function of Japan not having a separate service, the Army and Navy having their own forces? Harry?
Yeah, it's a really important point, actually. The Japanese Army Air Force in Burma does good tactical support, but higher up, particularly in Japan in the command center, it's a lot of army officers who don't appreciate the wider importance and application of air power. And I think you see that most profoundly in terms of the British efforts to bring in air transports. The Japanese never really appreciate the importance of interfering with those supply lines. And that would have made a huge tactical difference. In terms of supporting their ground troops moving forward, though, they are very good at bringing in close air support at times.
Right. So next question, Malcolm asks, how did the RN overlook the need for robust logistics and support planning when establishing and or transitioning from the Eastern Fleet to East Indies to the BPF?
So that's a really great question. I think it's a little unfair. It wasn't really overlooked, but they could not deploy the assets and the resource necessary to do it until the war against Germany, the European war, was over. So there is only a finite amount of shipbuilding capacity. The Americans aren't going to build this for us. Even the US shipbuilding capacity is fully committed for the Pacific War and for the European war in support of Normandy and things like that. That nobody has the capacity to build these ships. The British have to improvise them. What are they improvising them from? They're improvising them from merchant ship hulls mostly. Now, those merchant ships are fully deployed until the Battle of the Atlantic is won. That there just aren't the ships spare to do it. So the planners are perfectly aware of what they're going to have to do when the BPF is deployed. They are frustrated, I suspect, that they can't do it. And as soon as it's possible to start switching focus to the Pacific, they do it. And they produce that improvised little bit Heath Robinson Heath train, but they do it phenomenally quickly. And I think they deserve a lot of respect for that. So they're not surprised by it, but the resource is just not there. The Americans aren't going to do this for us. They're not going to build this for us. So we have to improvise it ourselves. Really, I think that's the answer.
Mm-hmm. And stay on, Nick, because there's another question sort of linked. It's from Diana. She asks, please tell us more. Can Nick tell us please more about the relationship with the US in the Age Pacific?
Yeah, I mean, this is just such a great question and such a great story. Politically, the Americans don't want the British there. Winston Churchill does want the British there, and this speaks really to your opener, that this is all about post-war politics. The Americans want to be seen to have defeated Japan on their own and to be the dominant player in the Asia Pacific region at the end. Plus, they have a moral and ethical objection to the British recreating empire, and the US does not want to in any way support the British rebuilding their colonial empire. So there is a kind of national pride plus a sort of ethical dimension that pushes the Americans into keeping the British out. Equally, Winston Churchill, who is for rightly or wrongly a passionate imperialist, he would not have denied that. He wants the British Empire back. He thinks it's very important for the British to be there at the finish because of that post-war world. And also, I think in his defense, I think he feels the Americans were there for us. We should be there. We should be there alongside them, helping them defeat Japan. So the political machinations of getting the BPF deployed are incredibly complex, and the Americans are incredibly reluctant. And ultimately, the decision is made because of the Churchill-Roosevelt relationship. That's why the BPF is able to deploy ultimately, because Roosevelt says, make it so. Mm-hmm. And the terms and conditions under which the BPF deploys are very strictly, initially, that the British are not supposed to have any support or resource from the Americans. The attitude is kind of, if you go, you've got to look after yourselves. So they create the big fleet base in Australia. They're given the forward base at Manus and the Admiralty Islands, the forward operating base from the Americans, which is one the Americans have passed by. They actually work incredibly hard to build a really good operational relationship with the various commanders of the US Pacific Fleet. So Chester Nimitz, obviously, at the top of it, Halsey, Ray Spruance, the American commanders at the front warm to the British. There are some advantages to having the British there. The British armoured fleet carriers, which I could go on about for ages, they earn the respect of the Americans. Kamikaze aircraft bounce off armoured fleet carriers, whereas they tend to go through the decks and set large fires in American fleet carriers with their wooden decks. So they find a use for the British. But even so, the British are Task Force 37 or 57 of the US Pacific Fleet. Even that is something of an exaggeration to give them a little bit of deference. They're smaller than most US task forces. They are kept slightly on the peripheries, and there's two examples of that, and then I'll finish. In the Okinawa campaign, the British are given, really, Sakishima Gunto is the British part of that operation. Sakishima Gunto is very, very important. It's a staging post for Japanese aircraft heading to the Okinawa theatre. So the British are pounding Sakishima Gunto throughout to stop the Japanese flying in air support. It's really important, but it's also not Okinawa proper. And the even bigger example is when, towards the end, when they're carrying out raids into Japan, almost unopposed, bombing Japanese installations in the home islands. The British are not allowed to finish off the Japanese fleet. And that's made very, very clear that the Americans identify what's left of the Japanese fleet, which is kind of heavily camouflaged, lying up in dockyards without any fuel. It's a strategically no threat at all. But the Americans want to do that because of Pearl Harbor. And the British are not allowed to strike any major warships in Japanese waters. It's all done by the Americans. So it's a difficult relationship right the way throughout, which works operationally. But even Admiral Halsey, the American Admiral Halsey, who's very respectful of the British, it's Halsey who's determined that they won't be doing that piece on Japanese warships at the end.
Right. So the next question is from Harry, who asks, should Wavell have accepted Chinese troops into Burma when they were first offered, instead of waiting until it was too late? Peter, I guess.
That sort of leaps straight to me. I think in this case, hindsight is a very easy thing to say. If you were to offer, and say, well, look, obviously more people would have been a greater asset and would have helped you stem the advance. That's easy to say in hindsight. Mm-hmm. At the time, also, the amount of the quality of the Chinese troops available was incredibly variable. We are used to talking about the Chinese and the operations there in 1944, but by that stage, they've had 2 years of equipment by the training by the Americans that they're going to fight alongside, which makes a huge difference to their combat performance, which by that stage is very effective. So I don't think it's that clear cut to say, yes, he should have accepted them. There was very minimal experience or understanding of using the Chinese, so that would have taken a bit of bedding in time to about how they could be officered and how they could be marshalled effectively, which may have had an overall detrimental effect on the campaign and use of the British resources. And there's also undoubtedly a similar bias that was extended towards the Japanese anyway, about the inferiority of some of these troops versus those of the European, but in particular the Indian martial races. If anybody missed Tariq Bakawi's talk as part of the program yesterday, you'll be able to watch that actually, and all of the other things that we've done on our Crowdcast channel on the replays. But if you watch Tariq Bakawi's in particular, he talks very much about the view of the Indian Army in 1939 and 1940 and how that's challenged by the war. And a similar view extends to the Chinese, I think.
Mm-hmm. An anonymous user asks, kamikaze attacks were a new threat to deal with for the Navy. How did this affect the way they fought, retaliated? Did these types of attacks affect the other services in the same way?
So I can certainly take the first part of that. I mean, what a great question. Yeah, kamikazes are the definitive new threat. Kamikazes are suicide aircraft. The Japanese start deploying them quite late, and it's a reflection of just their limited training of their manpower, that by the end of the war, they've got pilots who've had just a few days training or a few weeks training. They're up against incredibly well-trained Allied pilots. Their aircraft are really quite obsolete now. So they turn to suicide as a weapon, which is something obviously very, very familiar to us all today. Now, the problem that the Navy has to face is that dealing with a suicide pilot is very, very different to the kind of fighting they've been doing in Europe. If just to take a simple example, if you have a German Stuka coming at you in 1942, if you put enough flak up in the air and you damage him and you can scare him off, not all of them, but some of them will be driven away by the weight of fire that's put down on them. With a suicide aircraft, you literally have to blow it to pieces. Because the guy is not going to be deterred by anti-aircraft fire or by being shot full of holes. If he can get in there and he can hit the ship, he will. And the damage that they do is absolutely huge. So the most obvious response to it is absolutely covering the warships in anti-aircraft guns. Light anti-aircraft guns are the solution to this. Put as much steel in the air as you possibly can. And they cover the ships in AA guns wherever they can put them. I remember in a previous life, I used to work on HMS Belfast, and we had photographs of Belfast. She went out to the Pacific, but she missed the war. They stuck a Bofors gun on the top of B turret on Belfast. I mean, they were putting them everywhere they could place them. That created tremendous pressures on the ships because all those AA guns need crews. So they didn't have the mess deck space. The conditions on board were pretty awful. Fighter control is hugely important, vectoring in defensive fighters to break up kamikaze attacks before they get anywhere near you. The Americans pioneered the use of radar picket destroyers. So you string destroyers out 10, 20 miles away from the fleet to give advance warning of an incoming attack. those radar picket destroyers again in turn turn into targets, and the Japanese make a point of blowing the radar pickets out of the water. So it's a very, very different war, and they have to adapt to it incredibly quickly. And again, I think we must give them respect for that. The Americans have had 3-4 years to learn how to do this. The British don't. They have to adapt incredibly quickly. I can't talk for the other services. I don't believe kamikazes were a similar threat in the land and air war, but I will defer to my colleagues on that one.
Well, for the air war, I think it's worth pointing back to the first question we had, which is that the Japanese Army Air Force and Navy Air Force are different. And particularly in Burma, the Army Air Force quality of pilots maintains itself at quite a high level, which is different to the Japanese Navy, where there's a gradual diminishment in the skills that Japanese pilots being used, which is what Nick touched on, which means there isn't quite the same need for kamikaze tactics. Instead, as Allied air superiority is increased at the front in Burma, the Japanese Army Air Force has eventually pulled back with its losses because, of course, it anticipates fighting again in other theatres. So it's a very different war in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
From a land perspective, it's one of the things that becomes well known from the soldiers on the ground is that the Japanese are extremely reluctant to surrender, and will probably keep attacking and effectively until they're all killed. And when they do surrender, it's often because they are very, very severely wounded or very, very sick, or they're just completely broken by a lack of supplies and things like that happen towards the end of the war. Even so, there's an enormous reluctance even to risk trying to take surrenders, because often there are many, many published accounts of soldiers going forward to try and take a surrender in good faith, and then Japanese soldiers pulling grenades or turning weapons on them when they get close enough. So there's obviously, we don't have the technology to engage in what we understand as kamikaze type attacks. That same sort of fatalism was very much present and very much part of it. And I think that's definitely manifested itself into the films that we see now of this war. If you think about how the Japanese are portrayed, think about a film like Windtalkers or Flags of Our Fathers. There's nearly always some kind of suicidally reckless Japanese charge where an officer with his katana is holding it aloft and running forward and leading his men screaming. And that characterization about how the Japanese fight is something that I think that we continually live with our understanding, our memory of the war in the Far East. The British don't play as big a part in this. I think the only real war films about this are Merrill's Marauders and Objective Burma, where Errol Flynn wins the war. But he's Australian. But on behalf of things, George McDonald Fraser often talks about that as well, and says it would have been really funny. He served in Burma, and he would have liked to have seen that when they were out there, just so they could all poke holes in it and have a good laugh at his expense. And I think all of these things do definitely characterize how we remember the war and how we see it, and also it's a self-perpetuating cycle about, because this is how we remember it, this is how we talk about it, and this is how we envision it, and that's what we pass on to future generations of people.
Mm-hmm. Right. So we have a lot more questions and we're running out of time. Here's a quick one. Malcolm asks, how is the contribution of the Commonwealth Naval Forces to the British Pacific Fleet viewed?
Yeah, another good question. I'll try and keep it brief. The Commonwealth Naval Forces are out there before the main British fleet. I think we absolutely must make that point. The Australians are serving with the Americans almost from the beginning. The Australians and the New Zealanders are also out there operating with the Americans. The Royal Indian Navy is operating basically as an independent formation in support of the Army in the Indian Ocean. So I don't, again, like the wider sense of the Asia-Pacific War, that's definitely known to the specialists and those with an interest. I think for the wider audiences, it's not as appreciated as it should be. And actually, the Australians experience kamikaze attacks before the Royal Navy does. So, really important point.
Mm-hmm. So there's another question about tracing relatives' records. Pat asks, my great uncle George Lewis was in RAF 102-3666-62 Squadron. He was captured 1942, liberated such a date, prisoner of war, Ambon. Fortunately returned for me to meet him. Are there any good books about this camp that would give me any background?
I think the best place to look on is I think it's Kofi Pal, which is a website online, which is a great resource list. But also if you write into the inquiries line at the RAF Museum, it's currently closed because of COVID-19, but you can make an inquiry still. When it's reopened, they'll get back to you about anything which is particularly relevant.
Mm-hmm. Right. So another question, there's a question from Peter who asks, what does the panel feel about the pros and cons of dropping the atomic bombs on Japan as opposed to continuing the war by more, dare one say it, conventional means? So That's one for all of you.
Oh gosh, who wants that one? I'll kick it off, and I think I suspect others will have maybe similar views. I think we have to try really hard not to apply the context of today on that decision. The decision makers of 1945 were not aware that they were starting a nuclear war or that they were the first people to use nuclear weapons. They were deploying a new and better weapon in exactly the same way as they had done all the way through the war. Bombs and other weapons had got bigger and nastier and more destructive and more capable. And that's what they thought they were doing. So that, I think, is my first point. My second point is I have yet to meet a single sailor or read the accounts of a single sailor who didn't greet that event without huge relief, because it meant they would not have to take part in an amphibious operation off the Japanese coast, which just the experience they'd had in Okinawa made them think this is going to be even worse. They knew that the Japanese were husbanding air assets to throw at the fleet. Everybody felt that the invasion of Japan was going to be an extremely bloody and unpleasant experience, and the initial response that they all had was just relief that they weren't going to have to do this. We obviously now know the reality of what the impact of those bombs was. I don't think any of us ever want to see that happen again in the world, but I think the context of the time is important.
Yeah, I was going to say, and Harry can correct me here if I'm wrong, but this is not a good argument for or against it, but it's an observation that's probably quite important. But the firebombing of places like Tokyo kills as many, if not more, people than these devices. So it's not as if conventional means are to protect civilians in the type of war that's being fought in the Far East by that point.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true for the firebombing of Tokyo. It's huge casualty figures for it. I think Nick's point, this is something we shouldn't want to see again. Best civilians, it's something which we shouldn't have any celebratory tone when we talk about. I think it's quite sobering to see this is how the war ends and how a new era starts. And there's also the wider morality question, which isn't just linked to the nuclear bombs, but again, the firebombing in Japan and also in Europe, of bombing of civilians. And that's really a question for individuals to make their own minds up about.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, all I would add to that is I would echo Nick's points about how the servicemen respond and greet this. The soldiers that go in to occupy Japan in the aftermath, lots of them go and visit Hiroshima, and they are actually staggered by the level of destruction, and it is sobering. They've greeted the news of the end of the war with enormous relief, because exactly as Nick says, they are expecting to have to fight all the way. The tenacity, which I mentioned in my previous answer about how the Japanese stand and fight, they're expecting them to literally do that virtually to the last person in Japan. That's the common theme amongst the soldiers on the ground. So they do greet this with enormous relief. They are then staggered by the level of destruction, because it's beyond comprehension. Amazingly, the Field Marshal Edward Bramall actually saw both Hamburg and Hiroshima, because he was sent from Europe to Japan to occupy the forces. I think he's the only person, certainly the only person I know who ever actually did that, which I think is amazing. I will add just one extra point, though. It is interesting about the use of the weapons. I don't ever, personally, from my reading and my understanding, I don't believe those weapons ever would have been used in Germany. I think there is a strong racial component about dropping them in Japan. Had they been ready and had the war continued, I still don't think they would have been used in Germany or in Italy or anywhere like that. So I do think that should be borne in mind when we think about the reasons why they were deployed. But I think Nick's analysis of the strategic situation and exactly as Harry says, also about the moral use and and George's point about the way that conventional weapons are also absolutely savage in their use as well, all bear in mind and are relevant to the discussion.
Can I just jump in? Sorry, with just one last point. That there is so much evidence for that fanaticism as well. They're not making this up in a vacuum. And if you look at what happens when the Americans are in I think it's Saipan, where there is the first time they encounter an extensive civilian population as well as military personnel, and the civilians are in the fight, and then there are mass suicides at the end of it by the Japanese civilian population as well as the Japanese military. So all the evidence is there for that what they'll be like in the home islands.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask George to give us a little, insight here. Were there any British army people or civilians injured in Hiroshima or Nagasaki? Do we know?
We know of one. So Corporal Ronald Shaw of 84th Squadron RAF, who's being held at Fukuoka 14 camp in Nagasaki. He's captured after a Blenheim crash. So he survives all those hardships. He ends up in Nagasaki in a POW camp. And when that second atomic bomb goes off, it destroys much of the structure of the camp. And I think, as we understand it, he's killed by a collapsing wall, which is tragic in many ways. The final act of the war, potentially, like that, is also the one that takes his life. But that's one example. It's likely that there were others, especially other nationalities as well. But
of course, of
one we know of.
course. Right. So on with the other question. So Andrew asks, could the Japanese have been defeated in Malaya with better British leadership, planning, and resources, or was the British defeat inevitable?
I mean, the flippant response to that is yes, of course. But the more in-depth response and nuanced one is that I think that what you're asking there is three major components that contribute to that defeat, and changing all three of those things would have required enormous change in strategic thinking, political thinking, and resource management within the British at the time, and this simply wasn't available. Sort of an interesting counterfactual is if people were the question I think you would pose is if you wanted to put better frontline infantry divisions or better trained Indian Army divisions, something like that, into guarding Malaya in the expectation of a Japanese invasion, would you be willing to sacrifice any of the operations elsewhere closer to home in Europe? Which were the tough decisions that were being forced to be made from an army perspective, at least. I think. Yeah. Sorry, Nick.
No. Go on. Sorry, do finish.
No, so I was just going to say. So, Andrew, the simple answer is yes. I don't think their defeat was inevitable, but I think they made so many mistakes that when you that it would have taken a huge amount to have remove that. The sheer there's political failings, there's strategic failings, there's limitations in equipment. All of these would have been massive and so difficult to have addressed at the time without the defeat laying bare the weaknesses of British Far East military strategy.
I think, again, if I can give it, so from the naval perspective, the flippant answer is yes, but only if you don't start a war with Germany and Italy at the same time. But the less flippant answer, if you look at the strategic situation at the end of 41, the only way they could have done it would have been to give up the Mediterranean. I mean, you obviously can't give up the home islands. The fundamental purpose of everything is to protect the British Isles. They would have had to give up the Mediterranean. I think the what if consequences of giving up the Mediterranean and the forces in North Africa, the Suez Canal zone, all that stuff would have been absolutely catastrophic. And that's the only way I can think they would have been able to scrape together enough assets to put a decent sized fleet out into Asian waters.
All right. So here's a question about film. To what extent, Susan asked, to what extent was the success of the film Bridge on the River Kwai distorted the view of the real events? Who would like to answer, Peter?
Yeah, I mean, as military historians, and particularly, and Nick and Harry will know this well, we're nearly always asked about the historical accuracy in films and how significant and how important it is. People go and see films because often they're dramatized or fictional. They're going to see documentaries, and they are different things. When the Bridge on the River Kwai was made, it did attract some controversy because there was an idea that it portrayed the British in a very inefficient, inaccurate light. There are appeals to the government and the War Office to help make that film. That many people in the War Office making those decisions, for example, were actually there and worked on the Thai-Burma Railway and say, I remember what it was like, and this is not what I've seen from the script. And so it comes out, and certainly when it comes out into some controversy as well, mostly because it appears that all the cast in it are just simply too well fed. And they don't look like they've been subjected to the horrific treatment that we know the prisoners of the Japanese working on there were. Also, virtually missing from that film is the role of all the native labourers that the Japanese forced to work on it too. So I feel like this has coloured our understandings and representations of the war in the Far East. And for many, it just means that whilst it gets people interested and whilst it encourages people to understand that the war did operate beyond Europe, which is a really important thing, can be a springboard into wider knowledge. It shouldn't be taken as this is what the war in the Far East was.
Mhm.
So I can just add to that. I think what the film does do is, of course, hide the importance of air power in striking the Thai-Burma Railway, but also say that you can watch us tomorrow and talk about this, because we're talking about it at 2 o'clock, I think.
Oh, perfect.
I
Right.
think just a quick one on that as well. I think that shaping of our perspectives of the war in the Far East, the prisoner of war story, I think, whilst important and tragic, has always been incredibly heavily weighted in our understanding of the war in the Far East. And I think Bridge on the River Kwai is part of that. I think it's maybe a symptom rather than the cause, actually.
Right. Okay, so we move on. We'll take 2 quick questions. These will be the last 2. Truls asks, what was the British military, all ranks, attitude to being ordered to take part in fighting against diverse anti-colonial independence movements in the immediate post-war era? So Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, etc. Sometimes fighting alongside Japanese former enemies. This is something you were referring to, Peter, earlier. So
yeah, and sort of the classic historian's answer, it depends. It depends on the unit, it depends on the place. In one of the most notable examples, when the British are deployed to French Indochina, and they're actually having sort of set twos with the Viet Minh and the nascent Viet Minh there. And the British officers at the time, not only are they saying to the French, look, you guys you really don't know what you're doing and you're onto a hiding to nothing here. They are also saying to the French, well, you know, the way in which you treat and in the British officers were saying, the way you treat my Indian soldiers is absolutely appalling. And I have no willingness to stand beside you. In other ways, in other places, you know, the Indian Army soldiers deployed to places, Sumatra and Jakarta, and in these places to try and put down some of these insurgencies there. And I think it ties into this wider point about what the new world, especially in the Far East, is like in the aftermath of the war. We tend to, again, if we apply a particularly Eurocentric view of the Second World War, we tend to think of the war ending on VE Day, the collapse of Nazi Germany, but, you know, Britain, France, America sort of carrying on as before and not really being subjected to any kind of enormous structural change. Yes, there's huge political and economic and social change. Yet in the Far East in particular, what the war has done is it's awoken a huge conflict of nationalism, revolution, ideas. The Japanese have fostered these as they've tried to take some of these back, and then they've squandered all the goodwill they had by being so brutal in their occupation, which is particularly true I think in India and the role of the Indian National Army as well. And so all of this creates a world that is, we talk about VJ Day as the end of the Second World War. That's a highly debatable question, I think, a questionable statement, because for many the Second World War continues and just moves into a separate phase, which is the struggle for independence in so many of these places.
Right. So this will be the last question. We have run out of time, but we're just carrying on. Yai Faba asks, how does the younger generation in the UK see the war in the Far East? Are they interested in knowing more about it? Will they consider visiting the battlefields of Imphal, Kohima, and Burma in the future, like they do in the case of World War I and World War II battlefields in Europe? Very good question. Yeah.
It's an excellent question. I think I can only speak for myself as not as a member of the younger generation. I can't say that I know. I do, however, have children aged 19 and 17. I think they are far less aware. I think that the First World War battlefields are almost a ritual now for the younger generation. They go and see the First World War battlefields. They go to Ypres generally, and I think that's not there. I think the story isn't told necessarily widely. I think the logistics are almost insurmountable. Not only are these places a long way away, but some of them, Burma in particular, are kind of not ideal places to just travel in and backpack in. So I think it's really, really challenging. And it's part of our job as historians to try and tell that wider, nuanced story of how global the Second World War was.
Yeah, I might jump in just from the perspective of the Commission, because we care for a great many sites globally. It would be no word of a lie to suggest that the Western Front and the First World War dominate battlefield tourism, as you might refer to it now. And so whatever it is, or for whatever reason people travel, whether it's as pilgrims, if you like, almost, or as part of a wider attempt to understand or engage with this history. It's really easy to get to France from the UK. It's really easy to get to Belgium. It's quite hard, as Nick says, to get out to places in the Far East. So if we can't do that, if we can't facilitate that, there must be other ways. And I think there's probably, we're proving that right now. There are ways of getting greater reach and sharing these stories with technology. And I would like to see, we've spoken about it at length, but the fact that these are, to some extent at the time, they were forgotten, these men and women. We're making inroads now, but it's something that I think we need to continue pushing and to encourage greater engagement with this history.
I think there's a challenge and a commitment there as well, isn't there? In that, we've just said it, the technology's there. It's up to us and our organisations not to just make this for VJ Day only and then move on to something else and forget about it.
Yeah, and that's absolutely right, and that's exactly the point I was about to make. We throughout this we've used the hashtag Never Forgotten, and for us as museum professionals and historians, this stuff is they're not the forgotten army, because we talk about this every day. What we live with in the collections, I walk past equipment they used. I see it every day when I'm in the office. I read about it, and yet it's our job to continue to carry that to the public. I think when we look at the battlefield tours, we've got to think about the fewer numbers of British soldiers who were there as well. This plays a part in how many people. The intrepid travellers will always go out there. People have gone to Imphal and Kohima in Nagaland. And yet, if you look at the Arakan, which is where the scene of so much fighting, really where they turn the tide against the Japanese, that's in Rakhine State now, and that's just not safe. So there are these deep instabilities in that part of the world that will limit whether people can get there. We've just seen now that if you go to France, you've got to be quarantined for 2 weeks when you come back. So that's going to limit the number of people going out to Western Front battlefields and Normandy and that sort of thing in future. So there are all these external factors that can limit people's participation and rituals of revisiting and walking these places. I certainly would love to go. And yet, as with many people, time, distance, money, all of these things play a part. But I hope that the more we continue to talk about these battlefields, the more that we continue to tell people about it, and the more that we've got a fantastic audience like this who are engaging and actively learning in it. And I was reading in the comments, so many people's wonderful comments about their own family members who served. And we'll keep this stuff alive, and it won't be forgotten. And even if no one can get there, we'll still remember it.
Right, absolutely. Well said. And I think that is a fantastic note to end this on. So thank you, all of you. You've really enlightened us today. And I'm sure there'll be so much more. Thank you to all those who listened to this and put in all those questions. But don't go away yet, because, we are not all live, but I would say give a good round of applause to all our panelists today. So I'm just going to do it on my screen, and all of you do it at home. And don't go away yet, because you're going to get to see a trailer soon for another program coming up. It's a trailer for Captain Sir Tom Moore and Private Joseph Hammond in conversation, and they will be on NAM's website. So watch that trailer, and as Peter said, keep following these stories, keep these stories alive. So thank you all for being here today, and we will stand by for the trailer now. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
I didn't get a cup of tea then.
No, I mean, well, if I could pass this through,
yes, please.
then I would.